In the last month, we've seen some of the biggest fumbles in gaming. Shit! Companies making decisions that are anti-consumer and were attempts to further the company's reach or fill their purse at the expense of the player. And each has cost them something they won't easily get back: the goodwill of the community. So let's dive in and break down exactly what impacts we're seeing.
Get ready, everybody. He's about to do something stupid.
The after effects these choices had on the companies themselves, and the growing power of the consumer. We're talking Sony's PlayStation account bullshit and Battlestate Games' attempt to scam their true believers. And while this is old news now, the impact that those decisions had are what I want to focus on today, because that lost goodwill is coming back to bite them both weeks after the news cycle has moved on. Let's break down exactly what I mean by goodwill. Goodwill is an invisible currency that companies trade in with their players and represents the overall reputation of a business. This is actually tied to the value of companies when they are sold, as a company with a lot of goodwill is likely to have a loyal player base who are already in a mindset of positivity when they hear a company's name, while a company that's lost most of this will be seen as less desirable, and when you hear the name of a company you dislike, you're immediately less likely to want to engage in their future products. Let's give a quick example of this. Blizzard Entertainment was the golden child through the early 2000s, and one of the most celebrated gaming companies of the time. If you asked any gamer what they thought of Blizzard, you would have heard unending praise for their games. Then the dark times came, and today Blizzard, while still being a massive game company, have lost their reputation and the goodwill of the player base. Any upcoming release is met with a concern and wariness. If you ask players their thoughts on the Blizzard of 2024, well, you get the idea.
Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
Now, let's look at Sony PlayStation. They came swooping in trying to push an agenda that almost sunk one of their biggest game releases of the decade. Their decision to force all players who own Helldivers 2 to sign up for a PlayStation account was one of the most brain-dead moves I've seen in gaming. Now, this was a doozy. If you aren't familiar, the short version is Helldivers 2 released. There was joy in the world. It was breaking industry trends. It was a true worldwide success. Then in came Sony like the fucking Kool-Aid man, smashing down the wall to announce that everyone will now need a PSN account to continue playing. Problem one with this: not everyone wants to make a PSN account. Sony are not well known for their data security, and making an account to play a game I bought weeks ago? I've always hated second accounts for games, like Ubisoft forcing them in on everything, but if it's done day one, whatever, I knew what I signed up for. Sony introduced this a good couple of months after release, and the worst part? PSN accounts can't be made in over 100 countries, and the game had been sold in many of them. So for those players, good luck, I guess? You just won't have access, and Sony offers their apologies. Now I want to do more than just bash this decision. That's already been done to death. Let's look at why they did it.
Why?
The obvious and likely answer is they want those juicy account signups. What does that do for Sony? It boosts their KPIs, which makes the business look like it's doing better than it is. You might forget to tick the box to say you don't want advertising, and for those suckers, you're getting advertised too. And your data is valuable, both from a research point for Sony, but also for them to sell or trade with others. Now, in Sony's mind, or in the mind of the executive that likely pushed the requirement, this would be a slight annoyance to the player. They would have forecast some backlash, and this is where goodwill comes in. This is Sony deciding to cash in some of that currency, knowing it won't be well received, but thinking that the benefit outweighs the risk. PlayStation as a brand has a fine reputation. Not sparkling, but not terrible. The idea here is that the decision annoys 1, maybe 2% of the player base who will be vocal, but no one listens to the minority over an issue as simple as account signups, right? So that will blow over, and then we'll have all that juicy data and signups. After all, the players love Helldivers 2, so they'll want to keep playing. What they didn't bank on is that over the last decade, players have grown. The general public are now much more aware of how their data could be mismanaged. And Helldivers 2 was unique in that it had fostered an incredibly tight-knit community who were very focused on looking out for each other, and who were attached to the developers, not the publisher. So when Sony's decision was going to see many Helldivers unable to play due to their location, they rallied around their fallen, or soon-to-be fallen, comrades. But Sony remained firm. Backlash is expected, and oh lord, look at the reviews. Now, we all know the outcome. They eventually caved and removed the requirement. But that lost goodwill continues. Ghost of Tsushima released this week, and because it is a Sony published game, it was immediately hit with a review bombing, which has since been updated. But it's an excellent example of a company losing goodwill with its player base, and this having an ongoing effect. These are games that are only linked because Sony published them, but they were both impacted by the greedy decision making of the company. I'm glad that the ire of the public was focused solely on the publisher, and in these cases it didn't spill over to the developers. Losing goodwill with the public is one of the most dangerous moves a company can make. It makes people less inclined to buy products or use their services, and as we saw here, the public frustration moved over to a completely separate game release. But this is just a small example. So let's look at a developer making that mistake. Battlestate Games makes and publishes Escape from Tarkov itself, and they came out to try and scam their player base to increase profits. They released their Unheard edition at a whopping $250 and engaged in a long, drawn-out argument with the player base over the definition of DLC, claiming that the new game mode wasn't a DLC, and negating it behind the ridiculous price tag of this new release shouldn't upset players who had been supporting the company with the purchase of the previously available $150 Edge of Darkness edition that previously promised all future DLCs. Now, this is one of the greatest developer fuck-ups of all time, mostly because of how insane it was. Imagine arguing that a new addition to your game, a PvE mode in a PvP game, isn't DLC with a player base that tells you it is, and they just kept doubling and tripling down. And this case is why I wanted to highlight this so badly. They made the decision to do this a week before one of their major competitors was set to release their beta, and 5 days before another competitor also released on Steam. Now, Escape from Tarkov popularized the extraction shooter genre, and it was a game that blew up one day kind of out of nowhere, so they haven't had competitors for the majority of their life cycle. And then the week two competitors are releasing, they shoot themselves in the foot. And this is where the lost goodwill comes into play. Battlestate have been slowly losing goodwill with their player base for some time. They've made questionable choices on content releases. When they released Tarkov Arena, they delayed many Edge of Darkness owners getting access while allowing others to buy in day one. And they have had fairly inconsistent and poor communication with their audience. When they attempted to sell this new edition and spent a week arguing the player base about it, they really did lose the last of the goodwill they had, before eventually reverting their decision and giving the DLC to those who had previously purchased the Edge of Darkness, which included that future DLC. And here is a key point. Reversing your decision does very little to get back what you lost, especially when you drag your feet in that reversal. Now, I've been gaming for more than 2 decades. Not much to some, much more to others. I've seen many games come and go, and when one game defines a genre and another comes in to take its share, there is always the argument from some diehard players that the second to market stole the idea, or stole game concepts from the first. And to a degree this is the case. Innovation is good, and we innovate by taking ideas from others and using them in new ways. Palworld is a good example of this. It jumped into the monster taming and survival crafting genres and created a very unique experience. And while its similarity to Pokemon frustrated many diehard fans, it was well received and was relatively different to any existing Pokemon games. Fortnite was also accused of copying the formula of PUBG. When you define a genre, those who love the first iteration will often come out and defend what they enjoy, and dislike seeing competition, despite it being good for the industry and those same players. People can be fiercely loyal to their brands. We see it everywhere. Those who look down on others for not owning iPhones, Tesla bros who can see Elon doing no wrong, and so on. When Arena Breakout Infinite released, I was taken back by exactly how much they copied the Tarkov playbook. And some of the similarities are egregious. I mean, they have the exact same keybinds, the weapon modifications look almost identical in many ways, and there is more, but they do innovate and have made a host of player-focused decisions the gamers have been begging to see in Tarkov. Now, I expected to see diehard Tarkov fans up in arms about this, but we saw a lot of the opposite. Many were praising this game, and in the same breath condemning BSG for their recent antics, because BSG had just shot the last of their goodwill to the moon. Players tired of their lies and bullshit were wanting something to replace Tarkov, so they could stop dealing with the developers themselves. And it was a colossal mistake for BSG to use the last of their goodwill right before one of their competitors arrived. And that's saying something when your player base would rather trust Tencent. So we saw very little backlash over whether the idea was stolen or whether certain parts of the formula were stolen. There is still some disagreement about whether they stole actual game files or assets, which should again lead to more players supporting BSG if they hadn't just given those same players the middle finger for a week while telling them they aren't true believers. And seeing the head of BSG now crying on Twitter about loyalty has done nothing but continue to fuel the player base's disdain for the developer. They barely apologize for trying to scam their players and are acting like it never happened. So how did consumers turn it around? They voted with their wallets, and they used their voices, and I really hate to say it, but spamming the ever-living fuck out of anything associated with those companies. I'll be honest, I've never been a fan of review bombing, but you've got to hit them where it hurts, and sadly, this is one of those avenues. Companies hate bad press, and hate bad press being highlighted, and it is hard to ignore an unruly mob of people copy-pasting into developer discords or on Twitter. Consumers are finding their voices more easily in the internet age, and as companies have come to realize the importance of public message boards and community tools, they're starting to see how quickly what would have been an isolated incident explode online into public discourse. Whether it's Sony fucking around, BSG scamming, or the classic Sonic the Hedgehog meme, consumers should continue to make noise, vote with your wallets, and maybe one day, companies will start to notice that when you act in player-friendly ways, you'll gain goodwill faster. Then you can push products out the door. Just look at Larian Studios. They started as a small dev, and they're now a darling in the minds of players for how beautifully handled Baldur's Gate 3 was. But hey, these are my thoughts. What do you think about review bombing as a measure to keep companies accountable? I'm coming around to the idea myself. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked it, hit the button. If you want to see more, well, hit the other button. And catch me in the comments to talk all things gaming. Cheers.